Welcome. I'm Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Susan Mendes Foundation for our 2022 series of Sunday programs on beautiful stories of rescue, resistance, and hope. Our foundation honors a rescuer, Aristides de Sousa Mendes. He was the Portuguese consul general in Bordeaux, France in World War II, and he saved thousands of refugees and paid a very heavy price. Now, Sousa Mendes exemplifies a person who enlarged the universe of his responsibility. And on today's program, we are featuring two other such individuals. We will be learning about William Alexander Scott III and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who likewise enlarged the universe of their responsibilities. And we are so blessed to have their illustrious daughters with us here today. Alexis Scott, who is a journalist with a very long career, 45-year career in journalism, both print and television. And Professor Susannah Heschel, chair of the Jewish Studies Department at Dartmouth College. Moderating today's program is the filmmaker of that beautiful film that I hope you all saw, Shared Legacies. And if you didn't have a chance to finish watching the film before the discussion program, you will have until tomorrow night at 10 p.m. Eastern to finish watching the film. So by all means, please do watch that film. You will see both Susannah Heschel and Alexis Scott in the film. So right now I'm going to turn the floor over to Shari Rogers, the filmmaker, and she will say a little bit about why she made the film, and she will introduce our speakers. Shari.
Well, thank you, Olivia, so much for all your hard work and the beautiful foundation that you represent. And likewise, how he inspired your foundation, Eliezer Ayalona, a Yad Vashem Holocaust survivor, in many ways inspired our foundation, Spill the Honey Foundation, that produced this film, Shared Legacies. And as we know, with Holocaust survivors, it was the ability for them to start communicating this horrific experience that they witnessed, and their ability to finally put words to an experience that even words could never grasp, that level of pain that allowed for some of the healing to begin to take place. And as we know, it was in many ways Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, his words of compassion, his words that lit the fire under so many people's emotions in America, that lit the fire under many ministers and many ordinary people and rabbis and different people in America, that also lit the fire to take what was so horrific in America, treating a whole community, the Black people, as if they were less than human at the time. And so therefore words and the courage of human beings to speak up, speak truth to power, and speak what they're witnessing is not that typical. And there are many people that we're a part of this, but we do have to give credit here, especially today, since this is the Mendes Foundation, for those people that speak out and inspire so many other people. So I feel privileged today to have Dr. Susannah Heschel and Alexis Scott, who not only are personally activists themselves and do their work and continue to do their work, but they have a proud legacy that they are also continuing, that I feel blessed to be a part of. So in terms of just briefly, before they get into their presentation, what inspired me about this particular film, I had just finished a film about the Yad Vashem tour guide who inspired so many people to care about genocide and to care about human justice. That I had met in Detroit at a beautiful museum in Detroit, where I'm from, is the Charles Wright Museum. And at the time, Dr. Martin Luther King's personal attorney was speaking there. His name is Dr. Clarence B. Jones, and he was at Stanford University as a professor. And Claiborne Carson was given the intellectual papers by Coretta Scott Kings to create a Martin Luther King Center at Stanford University. So what Claiborne Carson did was he also wanted somebody who really knew the inner thinking, the inner mind of Dr. King, to be firsthand, to be a part of the Stanford facility. So he picked Dr. Clarence Jones, and he was writing a book called What Would Martin Say at the time. And in Detroit, he had spoke about the book, but one of the chapters that stuck out to me was a chapter on anti-Semitism. And then specifically, he discussed in that chapter how Dr. King, it was very important that Dr. King told Clarence Jones that he would be the one to remind people of the 24/7 commitment of the Jewish people during the civil rights movement to their struggle. And so I thought Clarence Jones and I developed a friendship. And at the time, President Obama was president, and he was being honored at the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts. And fast forward, it was 2015. It was the 50th anniversary from the Selma to Montgomery March. And all of Congress went to Selma and Clarence. And we were talking, we said, how amazing if we couldn't start filming the living witnesses to that coalition of the event, of the civil rights movement. While the civil rights movement was a Black-led movement, this part of the history was not well known or wasn't discussed. There wasn't as much filming on the personal recollections of so many of those survivors that were still with us. So I feel very proud that we were able to get many of the surviving witnesses. So for instance, like Congressman John Lewis, blessed memory, he's no longer with us. And we were able to personally, interview with him, and having his personal recollections of this experience, I think is really contributing to American history, along with Reverend C.T. Vivian, and some of the other really important historical people that had such huge lives and made such a difference in America, but they also were a witness to this aspect of that history. So we feel blessed that we are able to capture some of their recollections of this history. So that's why we thought it was really important, because many of the 40-year-olds, whether they were Jewish, not Jewish, and below, don't know that this is an American history story that exemplifies the power of coalition building, that you can have differences in your community, but if you come together and find commonality and care about justice and care about making the world better, that you can find ways to work together to change America. And that's what we did then. And I think there's many lessons that we can extrapolate today moving forward as we're looking to work together as a world community from this small segment of time in American history. So these two amazing, distinguished women have so much to say, and they have so much, we have slides from each one of them. I'm so excited to introduce first Alexis Scott, whose grandfather really was the first Black newspaper ever in Atlanta. So she has not only a father that she's going to be talking about in terms of the personal experience in the civil rights movement, but her grandfather laid a foundation of activism, founding the first Black newspaper. So I don't want to talk too much about Alexis because she has so much to say about her own personal experiences, but we feel so honored to have her, who is representing in many ways, of course being her own journalist, but that her father was an eyewitness to this history. So not only was he fighting the war in America in terms of Blacks being treated horribly, but he was asked to, take pictures during the Holocaust. So I think this interconnection and how he still worked connecting the Holocaust with the civil rights movement and building bridges. I think Alexis is, one of the most amazing people to speak on this. And then after, we'll introduce Dr. Heschel. So Alexis?
Thank you. Thank you, Shari. And I'm just delighted to be here to share about my dad and his involvement during World War II as a witness to the Holocaust. He was actually drafted out of Morehouse in his sophomore year. He was studying there to prepare himself to go on to work at the family newspaper business. He wanted to continue his photography work. When he was first assigned in the Army, he worked with the unit that became known as the Tuskegee Airmen, the famous Black pilots group. He was then assigned to the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion. And that group was assigned to work for preparing bridges and roads. They were never intended to fight as Black members of the Army. They were in segregated units. And so they had the battalion, the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion, was to repair roads and bridges and find water in Europe. And this picture is one of the bridges that they repaired that enabled the rescue of the 101 Airborne Division that was trapped near Bastogne. This picture is a selfie that my dad took of himself. He did many selfies when he was in the Army and continued to do that for the rest of his life. But this was one that he took just before the Battle of the Bulge. And as I said, the Black units were never intended to fight. They were only to do support and repair work. But near the end of the war, which was in December of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge was a big, fierce fight, and they needed more soldiers. So General Patton called up the Black unit that he was a member of, and they got bullets for the first time. They were not given bullets before this point, and as Black members. They learned how to clean their guns every day, but they never got the bullets. So following the Battle of the Bulge, as Black units, they were called corps units, which meant that they were responsible for any call from any white division that needed more hands, needed extra work. So they were called by a white division to report to Buchenwald in April of 1945. And my dad went there with his unit, and he took pictures of several things, of prisoners milling about, trying to figure out where to go and how to get transport out. He said that he didn't think it was as bad as they had been told. So he started taking pictures, and then they kept walking through. And it was awful. He said he could not believe what he'd heard, that they were being treated so terribly and so brutally. And he continued to walk through with guides. At Buchenwald, prisoners actually liberated themselves. The political prisoners were strong enough to do that. Many of the guards fled the Buchenwald because they knew the end was near. And my dad said that they tried to kill 30,000 people in the last 2 weeks before they got there. It was just brutal, just awful. And he finally said that he had to put his camera away because he could not believe what he was seeing. It was so horrible. And he has pictures that are part of the U.S. Memorial Council Museum in DC. He gave them his negatives that he had. He was supposed to give his negatives to his officers, but he kept some so that he could make sure that they did not get destroyed. People could know what had happened there, because he said no wonder people wouldn't believe it, because it was so unbelievable, so unspeakable. At the time, He was only 22 years old when he saw this experience at Buchenwald. And he said they were like walking skeletons. And then there were piles of bodies everywhere. It's awful. And so he said he had to put his camera away. I saw these pictures as a child growing up, and they were really horrible. He didn't really talk about it until the 1970s. He responded to a call from Emory University for survivors and liberators. And he went and met Alex Gross, who was a survivor. And Alex called my dad and the other soldiers Black angels because they saved them. And they thought they were really dead, but they were not. They thought they were in heaven. But they survived and he survived. And together he and Alex became very good friends, and they toured schools and other organizations throughout the state to tell the story of what had happened at Buchenwald. And in 1981, my dad was presented an appreciation certificate from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council that is shown in this picture here. And later, President George H.W. Bush, Daddy Bush, appointed my dad to the Holocaust Memorial Council. Even though he responded to this call, he continued to break barriers. And in late 1980s, he developed a brochure with his pictures, a 12-page brochure with his pictures that he took at Buchenwald. And he also did a kind of a memorial piece that he wrote about his experiences there. And after he died in 1992, way too young, he was only 69 when he died, I was appointed to his seat on the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust. And there we were able to use that brochure as the basis for an exhibit that's done by the state of Georgia. And it appears in schools, and I've spoken with it in several schools around the state, even today, pre-COVID, that is. But the exhibit remains, and it shows also the similarities between Jim Crow in the South and the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany, and how everybody was separate and not equal. As I said, he was only 22, and this shaped the rest of his life. He did things like oil painting, writing poetry, and playing chess. He also continued to be a news photographer for the paper, as well as doing other things at the paper. This picture is a picture of a young kid who witnessed a lynching that's still unsolved in Georgia, in a small town east of Atlanta. And then 3 years later, this picture of the first Black police officers hired in Atlanta. It was very exciting for the citizens that day. Although they were not given bullets either, they couldn't get guns until 1962, and they could only arrest Black people. They were assigned to Black neighborhoods. So it was still a lot of Jim Crow going on in the South. But all of these men on the police force were veterans of the Army or military in World War II, but they were hired. This slide shows my dad playing chess in a story that was done about him in Ebony magazine, but he developed his skills of playing chess while he was on the boat from Europe to Japan. They disbanded his unit after the war was ended, or not the war was ended, but after the Holocaust rescue, and he was put on a ship to go to Okinawa. And by the time they got to Okinawa, they had to turn around and come back because they had already dropped the bomb in Hiroshima and the war was ended. So he decided he wanted to get a rating for chess and play chess. And thanks to his desire to be a human being and do what human beings do, he broke a lot of barriers with playing chess because he wanted a rating. So he had to go in a tournament. And when he got home shortly after I was born, he went to play in Nashville, Tennessee at the Peabody Hotel. They didn't want to let him in, but he got in because the members of the tournament said, well, if he can't play, we're going to all leave, he can't stay. So they gave him all this business about what he could do, what he couldn't do. He said, I came to play chess. And so he did play chess at the Peabody Hotel in 1952. And he continued to do this around the country, every chess open. He also set a record in Georgia as the first Black chess champion in 1963 in the US Open here that was held in Georgia. He also was the chair of the Georgia US Open Committee in 1967. So he continued to break barriers and do things that he wasn't supposed to do. And as such, he embodied the Double V campaign, which was a campaign started during World War II by Blacks who said victory abroad and victory at home. And my dad lived that for the rest of his life. He fought for rights and demonstrated how Black people are people too, and we can do whatever you can do. And there was nothing to fear from Black people. The thing that he said in his closing essay was that people have nothing to fear from me or anybody in my family. And that is the thing that has haunted Black people for such a long time in America. So everybody's afraid of Black people because they think they're going to do something to retaliate or do something bad. But that's not the case. We just want to have what everybody else has, a freedom to live and have an opportunity to do what we can do. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Shari.
Thank you so much. You can see how important Alexis Scott and what she has to say and her presentation of her father's legacy is so important to expanding the discussion and the knowledge of the civil rights movement, but also in terms of expanding important conversations today on commonality and how this, on Alexis's father and his bravery and his work, his commitment to carrying on, not only being brave to be the photographer in Nazi Germany, but to use those pictures to elevate the conversation in terms of the conversation about the experience in America and how his own concern for his own community and elevating and making sure that Blacks had their freedom, he still felt such a responsibility to another community, the Jewish community, by accepting that responsibility of being on the Holocaust board at the United States Holocaust Museum. So you can imagine our foundation trying to learn more knowledge, public knowledge about the Holocaust and the civil rights movement. Alexis and her contribution is priceless. I mean, there is no, it's just priceless. And I know they are continuing, her and her husband, Brian, that I've become very close friends with well, are going to be making a film about Beechtree and her own personal father experience so that the whole, America and people around the world can see what Blacks went through in America and abroad and how that connected to transforming America today. As Alexis clearly says, and I'd like her to go into this a little bit deeper, about how you did see this as the catalyst for the civil rights movement. People don't necessarily connect the experience to as the catalyst, what your dad went through and his military experience with the catalyst for the civil rights movement. So can you just go into that a little bit more?
Sure. I think it was a catalyst because of the Double V campaign that was started by a reader of the Black press in America, the Double V, victory abroad and victory at home. And many Blacks volunteered to serve because they wanted to show that they could do whatever that needed to be done as a military person. And they fought for freedom and democracy abroad. They felt entitled to fight for it at home, that they should be able to have it too. And even though there were not a lot of Black soldiers involved in the actual liberation of the camps, they were subjected to substandard treatment in the Army as well, because the Army was not desegregated until after World War II. And they wanted to, all of the soldiers, they felt like they had done this deed, and now it was time for the country to hold up its end.
And when you've either what your father has told you, or when you have presented your father's important, priceless pictures to an audience. What is the feedback? First, if you know, when you present it, for instance, to a Black audience, or do they, what is their feedback in terms of how you, in terms of connecting the civil rights movement and their own personal experience to the Holocaust? What have you found, or what have you taken away?
Everyone is really impressed by the photographs. They're so graphic, some of them. And also the fact that these were Black soldiers who had to endure the second-class citizenship while in the military. And also, I grew up in segregation too. I was born in 1949, so I've lived a good bit of, at least half of my childhood was in forced segregation. So I think it mattered a lot to see the parallels between what happened to Jews in World War II and what was going on in America, because my dad used to say that he couldn't believe that Jews were being treated so badly because they were white. He said at least Black people had value because they were slaves, but they wanted the Jews eliminated from the planet. He couldn't understand that. It made no sense to him. Such a horrible thing. And so he really felt that it was important to make sure that we reach out to people, other races and other religions and other faiths, so that we could all work together for the common good.
It's just amazing. So I'm so grateful for your work and your continued dedication. And we look forward to the film that you're going to put out so that young people all over the world can know this history. And I think it's a whole new portal to Holocaust education that really hasn't been unpacked. The connection of the Black soldiers that did contribute, and that connection once they came home. So I can't thank you enough for your contribution here. And I know you work closely also with the King Center as well. I mean, I know that you're friends, that you're close with Dr. King, Bernice King.
Yes.
And before we move on to Dr. Heschel, in terms of today, what do you think, how do you think this history can help bridge build today among our two communities? And of course, we know that there's so many Jews of color now that are playing a very important role in terms of helping bridge these two communities. But how do you see, you live in Atlanta, you're at the pulse of this all, given your history and what you experience today, how do you see our two communities or other communities working together? And do you see this as a bridge to help bind our communities?
I absolutely think that the Shared Legacies story is one that does continue to bind the two groups together, Blacks and Jews. And I think that we can continue to build on that in other ways. Dr. Bernice King and I don't see each other a lot, but we're close. We talk on the phone. But she's carrying a really amazing burden on her shoulders, but she has focused on conflict resolution and looking at differences from a point of view that we can resolve them without violence. She has a program called Nonviolence 365, and it's for youth and others who want to train on how to do conflict resolution. We relate to each other because as you know, her father was assassinated and her grandmother was also shot in church. My grandfather was assassinated. He was killed when he was only 32 years old, only 6 years after starting the newspaper. So we have a real strong common bond about nonviolence and how awful it can tear communities apart.
And the name of the movie that I see in the chat that Brian, her husband, and Alexis are working on is called Beech Tree. Is that correct? That's the name?
It's called Beech Tree Forest, and that's the English translation of Buchenwald.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now we're gonna come back to Alexis Scott at the end of the program, but now I have the privilege and the honor of making a quick introduction. You have her, Dr. Susannah Heschel's full bio online, but Dr. Susannah chairs the Jewish Studies program at Dartmouth. She's long been active in interfaith conversation and has focused her research on Jewish-Christian debates in 19th and 20th century Germany. There's many books and awards, but I just want to tell you a brief story of how Dr. Susannah and I met, that I think is important, since I was already thinking about starting to film at the 50th anniversary from the Selma to Montgomery March, based on Dr. Jones and I discussing it. Dr. Heschel was invited by Joanna Jackson in Selma. She is the daughter of the Jacksons, whose father was a dentist, and her home is now a museum in Selma. And Joanna Jackson had asked Susannah if she could come stay there during the 50th anniversary from the Selma to Montgomery March. And Susannah and I had met briefly in Detroit because she was lecturing here on one of her important books or papers. And she called me to just share with me that she was so excited about being able and being invited to stay at this home where many of the spiritual leaders gathered before the third march from the Selma to Montgomery March, where her father was a part of it. And I'm sure she will possibly include some of that as part of her presentation. But we were so honored to be able to film at that museum at Joanna Jackson's house. And actually at the time, Dr. Bernice King also thought that it was very important to be at this museum because we kind of have her in the background when she was, meeting with Susannah and Joanna Jackson. And so this was just an honor and just totally amazing that this coincidence of us all coming together to celebrate that this land in America is really holy land. If you go to Selma, it sort of looks like a third world country, but there's so many important, homes that are now museums and important people living in the homes. And this is the land is like a museum. So I think, we need to really study this Selma and honor the people who have worked so hard to preserve history in Selma. And I'm hoping that our film, plus some more films being done on Selma, can really get more people to go to Selma, because this represented the place where people of goodwill of all faiths, of course, including the Jewish faiths, that's what I focused on, came together to transform America. So with no further ado, I'm just so honored and privileged to have Dr. Susannah Heschel. She's been so gracious to lend her expertise, her knowledge to this film. She's involved and pulled in so many different directions. Even somebody last night called me and said, how did you get Dr. Susannah Heschel? She's on sabbatical. How did you get her? So, I mean, we should all be honored here because I think she's rightfully taking some time off, I'm sure, to work on an important project that she can tell us about. And so with no further ado, Dr. Susannah Heschel.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Dr. Shari Rogers, for a lovely introduction and also for this extraordinary film. I know for generations to come, we're going to be grateful for this film, that you were able to talk to people directly. And I also want to say that all of us here today, Alexis Scott, will remember what you told us and think about your father and the impact that it made on him. The idea that he would go to fight in the Second World War on behalf of the United States, first of all, in a segregated army, given rifles but no bullets, unbelievable, and go to promote democracy in Europe, and then be faced with the horrible trauma of witnessing what happened in Buchenwald and seeing these people who had been tortured and who were emaciated. And I can tell you, a few years ago, I went to visit Buchenwald, and it's empty, and it was horrible. I can't imagine what it did to your father. And as you say, it transformed him. And as actually Shari Rogers also pointed out, and you too, Alexis, that this was a catalyst for him, and an important one. And I just want to say that I think this film and the description you've given us today of your father, Alexis Scott, this I hope will be transformative for all of us. And it's wonderful that the Susan Mendes Foundation is sponsoring this gathering. I think it's great to have a foundation that pays tribute to an extraordinary human being, to a noble person who saved so many Jewish lives. I think we need to really keep in our hearts and in front of our eyes at all times the memory of people who were righteous, people like your father, Alexis Scott, like Susan Mendes. This is something that will inspire us and serve as a catalyst for us. I've been asked to speak about my father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Michael, I thank you for putting together these the slides for me, and Olivia Mathis, for organizing this. So I'll begin with a picture of my father, who was born in 1907 in Warsaw to a Hasidic family. Everyone expected that he would become a Hasidic Rebbe, but he actually decided at a rather young age that he wanted to study, that he wanted to learn other languages, to study philosophy, and to go to university. And so he took his knowledge of the secular world, of university learning, but it always was with his heart and with the soul that was imbued in him from his religious background. He said that he grew up surrounded by people of religious nobility. What did that mean to my father? You can see in the next pictures of him that he became a professor, a scholar. His life was saved by the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, which managed to get a visa to bring him to America. He said he was like a brand plucked from the fire, rescued from Nazi Europe. Unfortunately, he couldn't save his mother. His mother and 3 of his sisters were murdered. But what did he do with that trauma and that horror? First, he said, there are 3 ways to experience terrible sorrow. You can cry, you can be silent, or you can turn your sorrow into a song. And for my father, that song was to teach people about Judaism, and to teach people that Judaism isn't something that you just study. Judaism is something you live, that you embody. And so I want to show you one of the ways in which my father embodied Judaism. And that was in my father's relationship with Martin Luther King. My father knew racism. He knew anti-Semitism from Warsaw, and he was in Berlin from 1927 in Nazi Europe, Nazi Germany, after Hitler came to power until he was deported in 1938. So he knew about anti-Semitism, Nazi anti-Semitism, and my father also knew Christian theologians in Germany who said in the Nazi period that the Old Testament is a Jewish book and it should have no place in the Christian Bible. They said that Jesus was not a Jew, Jesus was an Aryan, a German, a Nazi, that Hitler was doing what Jesus wanted. So imagine my father came to this country. He came as an impoverished person. He was teaching. He married right after the war and had 1 child, and that's me. And I grew up in New York City, where my father taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary, rabbinical students. My father's life was in his study, writing books. But he also realized that as a Jew, he had to confront the racism of this country. And he met Dr. King in 1963 in Chicago at a conference on religion and race, 2 words that my father said should never be uttered in the same breath. They're diametrically opposed. Racism, he said, is Satanism, unmitigated evil. And I want to show you how my father became involved. He wrote, and this is a telegram. Some of you may remember telegrams. This was a telegram to President Kennedy, who invited religious leaders to the White House in the summer of 1963 in an effort to stop the March on Washington. My father responded to the invitation by saying that President Kennedy should declare a state of moral emergency in this country because of its racism. He said, "The hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity." My father worked together with Dr. King. They gave lectures together. You can see here press conferences. They spoke about racism, and they both also spoke about trying to free Jews from the Soviet Union. They talked about Israel, and they talked about the Bible. And I think what brought them together in such a close bond of friendship was that they read the Bible in similar ways. They read the Bible teaching that God cares about human beings and suffers when we are cruel to each other. And our task is to make more of God in this world through justice. My father gathered with other civil rights leaders. This is Albert Clegg from Detroit, a pastor. He was also close to Andrew Young and Reverend C.T. Vivian and so many others during the civil rights era, Jesse Jackson. But there are also certain special occasions. Shari has already mentioned the march in Selma. My father received an invitation to come to Selma to join the marchers. The invitation came on Friday afternoon, and Saturday night after Shabbat, after we made Havdalah, my father left for the airport. And I vividly remember the way he kissed me goodbye, because I didn't know if he would come back, because it was dangerous. But my father said about that march in Selma, he said, "I felt my legs were praying." He felt there was something holy in that march. To march for justice is a prayer. So my father was with Dr. King on many occasions. Dr. King spoke to many different Jewish organizations and to synagogues. There were also many in the Jewish community who supported Dr. King in different kinds of ways, as lawyers, but also raising funds for the SCLC. And then, of course, all the young Jews, young people who went south for Freedom Summer or as freedom riders, and rabbis, some of whom were also, like my father, refugees from Nazi Europe. They poured their hearts and souls into this movement. And I think when we think about why, I think part of it is that the civil rights movement was also an ecumenical movement. Dr. King opened the movement to Jews and to all people of all faiths and said, "Come, join. Let's bring the Bible alive." He quoted from Amos and Isaiah. And then came Riverside Church, April 1967. It was 1 year to the day, April 4th, before Dr. King was assassinated. And let's pause here for a moment. For Dr. King, the issue of racism also involved issues, first of all, of economic justice, of poverty. People sometimes ask me what my father would say today if he were alive. I would say the same issues are before us today. Why did they march in Selma for voting rights? You know what's happening in this country. People trying to take away our right to vote. Poverty is still with us, terrible poverty. Children going to bed hungry. People who have no access to medicine. And then there was war. The war that Dr. King said, the war in Vietnam, that was poisoning the soul of America. For a long time in my home, my parents debated if Dr. King should speak out against the war. And finally, he spoke at Riverside Church, and then there was a demonstration at Arlington National Cemetery where they prayed quietly for peace in Vietnam. These are other pictures from Arlington Cemetery, which is February of 1968. Dr. King was killed just a couple of months later. This was an amazing friendship for my father, an amazing moment, and you can see Rabbi Eisendroth from the Reform movement holding a Torah. Because for so many rabbis, the civil rights movement was an inspiration for being Jewish. It was an extraordinary moment. And it was a way in which I think after the Holocaust, our souls were lifted by the civil rights movement, by Dr. King's speeches, by his citation of the Bible. It was very healing for many Jews. Just 10 days before he was assassinated, Dr. King came to speak at a convention honoring my father, a convention of rabbis. It was a great moment. I was there that night, and everybody sang "We Shall Overcome" in Hebrew, the Concord Hotel in the Catskill Mountains. And it was a beautiful celebration of Dr. King and my father, of their friendship, and of the bonds between the Jewish community and the civil rights movement. And then came something terrible. Dr. King was assassinated. My father and my mother and I went to the funeral in Atlanta. It was devastating for all of us. My father, Mrs. King, asked my father to speak. I just want to say that Mrs. King and her children and all the people of the civil rights movement were so grateful for my father that to this day they express their gratitude 60 years later. And I find that extraordinary. I'm grateful for that friendship, for that relationship. And I have to say that it's really Dr. King and my father and the civil rights movement that made me fall in love with the Bible and become a professor of Jewish studies. So on a personal level too, I express my gratitude. Thank you.
Thanks, Susannah. You have so much information. People could want to interview you for hours and hours and hours, and I know you're always asked. So I once again thank you and thank you and thank you. But you know, there's one story that I think would be sort of heartfelt for people to know, is that your father was invited by your father invited Dr. King and his family to Passover dinner, and it was going to be the week after he was assassinated. And what's so extraordinary to me is the whole symbolism of Passover, being in many ways that Moses could be seen as one of the first social justice warriors, and how Ambassador Young always talks about how there's so many Old Testament stories that are discussed in churches, and that commonality in terms of elevating those biblical stories to making our own present day life much more meaningful and just. And if you could just tell a little bit about that, about what was supposed to be and what your thoughts are.
Oh, thank you. Yes, this is true, what Shari just said. That my father invited Dr. and Mrs. King and their children to come and join us for Passover Seder, because as you know, the civil rights movement was often spoken about as an exodus, and Dr. King was Moses, and that was the imagery that was used. And it made, I can tell you, made me so proud. This was my Bible and my Moses, and to hear Dr. King speak these words, and I felt so included. And you know, the contrast, I think of it from my father, from Nazi Germany and those Christians who wanted to threw the Old Testament out of the Bible to come to Dr. King. That was so affirming and wonderful. So I think Passover, yes, and I imagine, you know, all of us might think about this. What would it be like at a Passover Seder to have Dr. King present? And what would you read from the Haggadah or from commentaries, or how would you think about Passover in a different way? The Exodus has become so important in certainly in Black theology and in the civil rights movement, but in many movements of political liberation. It's wonderful. But I also think there is not just a political meaning. I want to just stress that I know for my father, and I say for myself as well, this was also a religious moment. This was a religious movement that was inspiring, that touched the heart, that moved people. And so that importance also needs to be recognized.
Yes, can I just add that in the Black community it was called a human rights movement, and became civil rights in media coverage because of the laws of segregation.
Thank you.
Interesting. Yeah.
So let me just take the floor back briefly to tell our audience about upcoming programs. And then Shari will moderate the audience questions from the chat box. I don't know if there'll be time for all of the questions, but she will make a selection. So next week, so some of our programs have tickets attached, like today's program. and other programs are free. For example, next week, we're focusing on a book next week called The Lost Book of Moses, and it's the story of the world's oldest Bible. And it's like a detective story, a true life detective story. We have the author Hanan Tigai with us, who spent several years researching this lost book of Deuteronomy that was supposedly found in the 19th century and then disappeared. It's quite an amazing tale. And he's going to be interviewed by another author, Victoria Riddell. So that's next week. The week following, we're focusing on a man, a very important figure who was saved by Aristides de Sousa Mendes. And that is the last crown prince of Austria, Otto von Hobsburg. Sousa Mendes saved all kinds of people, ordinary people, and the crown prince of Austria. He also saved Salvador Dali and his wife Gala. He also saved the authors of Curious George. So he saved people representing so much of our culture. So we're going to focus on Otto von Hobsburg, and we have his daughter, Princess Michaela von Habsburg, who'll be joining us from her home in Spain. And we have two other experts, one of whom interviewed Otto von Habsburg. So that's very exciting. That's coming up in 2 weeks. It's also a free program, but there's an optional film rental of our film, which is called Disobedience, the Sousa Mendes story, in which Otto von Habsburg appears. So that's in 2 weeks. In 3 weeks' time, we are focusing on the extraordinary story of the White Rose anti-Nazi student resistance movement and the brother and sister Hans and Sophie Scholl. We have a very, very touching film, and we have an inspiring speaker, Dr. Judd Newborn, who wrote a biography of Sophie Scholl. And so you certainly won't want to miss that. Like today's program, tickets are required for the Sophie Scholl program, but it's by donation of any amount, so whatever is comfortable for you. So now I'll turn it back to Shari Rogers for the Q&A, and following the Q&A, we'll have final thoughts from our speakers. Shari?
Okay, thank you so much. I'm trying to look for some questions that might be interesting. Let's see. Let's see. One question is, the relationship between Jews and Blacks is not what it was. Did the Jews pull away from the Blacks or vice versa? How can each group bring that back together? Is it being hijacked by the far left and far right? What is happening in politics?
May I say something about that?
Sure.
Because it's something that I'm involved with, that is, I would say, actually, I don't agree with the premise in this sense. You know, my father taught at a seminary of rabbis. He didn't have friends who were Black intellectuals or professors or students. But today, I have many Black colleagues, and I have colleagues at other institutions also. There is, in fact, a very lively and exciting many conversations going on between Jewish intellectuals, Black intellectuals, Jewish studies scholars, and scholars of African American history and African history. So in fact, it is quite lively. Maybe not everybody's aware of that conversation, but I can mention to you that one of the points that's very important that a friend of mine, J. Cameron Carter, teaches at Indiana University, makes in a book called Race, a Theological Account, is that racism is something that originates from out of anti-Semitism. So the connections between racism and anti-Semitism is something that is being heavily discussed by academics and by intellectuals. So I think, in fact, there's a much livelier and much more widespread dialogue going on today than in the 60s. And I think it's great.
Yeah, and I would just like to add, our own Congresswoman, Brenda Lawrence from Detroit, co-founded the Black Jewish Caucus with the American Jewish Committee and Congressman John Lewis, because the churches were being attacked and Jews were being attacked. And I think there was this understanding that we have, that our two communities has something very important to add to this conversation. And so for the first time in history, before Congressman Lewis died, they founded this Black Jewish Caucus. And I think I would agree with Susannah that there are wonderful organizations going around all over the country on Black Jewish relations. And I think as we move into the 21st century, we are so much about trying to figure out ways how we can work together. And I think
And may I also jump in? I think that it's, I agree with you. And you know too, Shari, that especially in Detroit, there's an excellent Black Jewish organization, dialogue group. But I also think we're in a moment of crisis because we know that in recent years, we're all shocked at the rise of violent anti-Semitism and violent racism and rhetoric that's also violent. And it's horrifying. And we know that white supremacists are running around saying, oh, you know, we have too many Black people, too many Hispanic people, too many immigrants, too many Muslims, so on. And why do we have them? What do the white supremacists say? It's the fault of the Jews, all those Jews who let them in, etc. So we're actually, whether we like it or not, we're bound up together in a moment of serious crisis in the United States, and we need to work together. And that's what's most important. We have to come together in an alliance because we're really facing something very, very frightening.
Yeah, I just add too, in Atlanta, the Atlanta Black Jewish Coalition is still ongoing and very strong. It was founded by John Lewis and Sherry Frank, who at the time was running the American Jewish Committee here in Atlanta. And also my participation on the board of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival was extended to me because of my involvement in building bridges and also understanding among different communities. And I attribute that to my father, who gave his whole life to bring communities together.
Yeah.
And perhaps I might respond to some of the discussion that appeared in the chat regarding Israel and Palestine. On the one hand, I have to say this is something that started already in the 60s with certain radical left-wing people, Black and white, identifying with Palestinians. And I honestly have read books about it, how it happened, but I don't quite understand why. There are many people, many parts of the world where there are terrible conflicts and terrible political situations. So that's something I didn't understand. I still don't understand. But at the same time, I have to say that, you know, as Beatrice Regan said, if you're in alliance only with people who agree with you, then that's not a coalition. And, you know, in my own family, I have Hasidic family, and I'm not crazy about the way they view women. Women shouldn't go to college and the whole clothing thing and sit behind the curtain, etc. But I love my family. I respect them. We don't agree, but that's all right. How can we find some places in which we have common meaning? And that's what's important. So I'm just concerned that often there are Jews who don't like, who are complaining that there's some people in Black Lives Matter who are anti-Israel. Okay, that may be. Let's sit down and have a conversation about Israel and about Zionism. And, you know, on the Black side, there are people who say, well, you know, this is Jewish support for Israel, take it or leave it, without any room for any kind of discussion or difference. That's no good. Well, it's true. Let's be a little more flexible on both sides.
Yeah. And I think, you know, what I learned from making the film, more importantly, is that many of these relationships weren't just showing up once a year. These were built relationships, and the closer you connect to somebody, you're much more likely to feel their pain or their situation better. And Susannah tells it best through her father's Hasidic story, but I think it's applicable to today. We can't just expect because we're showing this film or learning more about the contribution different communities had towards transforming America, but we need to remind ourselves another important lesson of this is that relationships need to be built, and the more you build the relationship, you'll be more sensitive to each other's pain and listen to it in a much more not reactive way. You'll feel you care about this friend, so you want to feel what they're feeling. You might want to say briefly that beautiful Hasidic story if you can. And Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
My father was named for one of his ancestors who was a Hasidic Rebbe in the 19th century. So his name was also Abraham Joshua Heschel. He was known as the Opta Rav, the rabbi of Opt. And and he was known for being a very loving person. He was actually asked to come to Mezhbish, to the village where the Baal Shem Tov had lived, the founder of Hasidism. And people would flock to see him all day, every day, dozens of people, and they would come to him to talk to him about their problems. And they would always ask him to pray for them, pray for me, for a sick child, for a parnasa, for needing to get a job, for finding a shidduch, a marriage partner, for a child, but for all kinds of problems and worries. And one day somebody asked the Opta Rav, how do you remember all of these people? Their names and their problems. And his response was, when somebody comes to me and they tell me their troubles, I open my heart and all of their sorrows come inside my heart and they make a scar. And when I go to pray, I open my heart to God and I say, look at all these scars. And I think that's, in a sense, the essence of Hasidism and what it wants to teach us and what it means to live the kind of life where you listen to people in that way. I think it tells us a truth, which is that all of us would love to be able to talk to someone who listens like that, where you know you're being heard in that way, where you have somebody who will pray for you and take your troubles as their scar and bring them to God. So I think for my father also, that's what the civil rights movement was about. He couldn't look at America and not feel that his heart wasn't scarred. Of course it was, scarred by the racism of this country, the brutality, the cruelty. Many of you remember what you saw in Birmingham when they send water hoses against peaceful demonstrators in Birmingham. You know what those water hoses do? They can rip the hair out of your head. That's how powerful they were. People were being tortured on the streets of America. How can it not make a scar in your heart? Of course it did. And that, for my father, was what it meant to be a Jew, to be a human being, to be a religious person.
So we are running over the hour, but I can't cut off such an amazing conversation. So let's take 5 more minutes and have some time for some final thoughts. And we haven't heard from Alexis, so perhaps Alexis, what would you like to say?
I just would like to say thank you again for the opportunity to talk about my father, who was an amazing human being. And thank you, Susannah, for talking about your dad, who also was an amazing human being. And Shari, thank you for your work and your efforts to build these bridges and spill the honey all over the place. This is what it's all about. And so I thank you all. Thank you.
Susannah, is there anything you would like to add?
I also want to say that it was really a great pleasure and honor to be with all of you, but especially with Alexis Scott. I think your father was an extraordinary person, and I know I will always remember what you've told us today. I thank you for that, and I thank him for the kind of life that he led, an extraordinary human being. I guess, you know what, I just want to say, there are many ways to respond to horrible trauma that your father experienced as a Black man in America, in the Army, and what he saw at Buchenwald. And, you know, I can imagine people just turning away in silence, just being overwhelmed, or people being angry. But what was so extraordinary about your father and about the civil rights era is the incredible generosity of spirit and the dignity that they brought to this country. I think that's a very important lesson for all of us. And so I thank you. Thank you for that lesson today. I appreciate it. And thank you, Shari and Michael and Olivia and all of you for coming.
Shari, what would you like to say?
Well, I hope the film sparks your soul, because when Alexis says, I hope we spill the honey all over the place, the goal of the film is to spark something that every single human being has in them, and that's their soul. And the soul knows what right is. Every person knows what justice is. So, you know, we can all live our comfortable lives, or, you know, many of our lives maybe did not witness the horrors of Rabbi Heschel, who lost his sisters were murdered, and the horrors of the Holocaust, or Alexis Scott, her father, witnessing Blacks not being able to vote, having to have a sign saying "I am a man," and witnessing the Holocaust. But what we can do is remember that we have to all of our souls have to be sparked with what they did. What we need to do in each of our own lives is to get out of our comfort zones, reach out to somebody else, reach out to another community to try to keep making the world a better place, because we have so much more work to do. And God forbid we have to go down to the trauma that both these communities lived with, but we still have so much more to go, and we need every one of your help, each and every one of you. And if there's Holocaust survivors watching this, or their children, your personal experiences so much touch people's souls, and they need to be sparked, because, you know, we all have personal problems in our own family, but we need to be sparked so that we can really give and stand up and speak and use our pain for the positive, or use our good experiences in our family for the positive, and to reach out. So thank you so much. Thank you for what you do. I'm so blessed. Thanks.
Well, this program has set a very high bar for the quality of our programs in 2022. And so I hope the rest of our programs live up to this one. And I'm so grateful to today's panel, the filmmaker, our illustrious speakers, and of course, our wonderful and loyal audience that comes week after week. I'm delighted that you're here, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Olivia, and everybody.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.